Welcome to Coffee and Contemplation. I'm Robin,
I'm Heidi.
and today we'll be discussing Chapter 5, The Flea and the Acrobat. I took another look through the book that you gave me, in fact, as a gift, Stranger Things Worlds Turned Upside Down, that I realized I should have been referencing a lot more before now because there's so much good stuff in this book. So I'm going to be, from here on, I will probably be referencing stuff that's in this. And in looking through this book, one thing that I noticed is that Tim Ives is the one that they go back to and they have quotes from for a number of particularly big visual moments in the show. And I think that that indicates to me, anyway, that he's kind of the driving force of a lot of the visual stylings, the visual approach, in conjunction with the Duffer Brothers, obviously, and the directors of each individual episode. And obviously, Tim Ives isn't the DP for every episode, but I think that might it led me to speculate that if part of the reason that season 1 feels like the best season to so many people is because it's the most visually consistent of the series as a whole. And I don't know that that's actually true, but it from this post season 3 perspective and thus far into season 1 on this rewatch, that seems to be the case. So that's part of why I like crediting like the production design and doing these production shout outs at the top here, because things like the production design often and the cinematography, people credit it and say it's beautiful, but I don't know if the consistency is something that people are aware of. So, but we'll see. All of that said, Tim Ives does in fact happen to be the cinematographer for this and each remaining episode in this season. So there's that. This time the writers were Alison Tatlock. On IMDb, she's credited with writing 3 episodes of Better Call Saul. And then again, Jesse Nixon Lopez was listed as a writer. Directed by the Duffer Brothers. The editing was done by Kevin D. Ross, who also edited chapters 2 and 3. A few more episodes this season, as well as season 2. For this episode, we're going to continue with our chronological breakdown. It's a long cold open this time, and it's this beautiful intercut between Hopper sneaking into the lab, Joyce, Lonnie, and Jonathan, and then the kids, and ultimately bookends with, opens with Hopper and then is bookended with Hopper. Then there's just interweaving of like the kids reading about the Veil of Shadows while Hopper is discovering the gate to the Upside Down. It's really our first real explanation for what this other dimension is and where Will probably is and where the monster probably came from. The reference to the shadow walk, when Dustin says, well, maybe, we can't shadow walk, but maybe she can. And even though she says no, she doesn't know how to get there, she does know how to explore the astral plane, which we see later on, but I thought that was a nice way to set it up that, yeah, she actually kind of can do that, if not get into the Upside Down directly. And then we have Joyce confiding in Lonnie and their conversation before Jonathan comes in.
The words that he's saying themselves are very reasonable, easily believable. You could very easily see someone who had the best of intentions saying these things. Like, I don't think you're going to like hearing this, but maybe you need to consider the possibility that this is in your head. And maybe you should talk to somebody like a psychiatrist or like a priest. Like when he says to Jonathan, you should not feed into these delusions because it's dangerous. Your mom is very vulnerable right now. I need you to help me, keep things on an even keel. When we're at the funeral, try to behave. But we know that Lonnie's full of shit because if he wasn't, he would have been here this whole time. He wouldn't have pretended like it was Joyce's fault when Will went missing. He would have actually shown some interest in his child before he supposedly died. And we see very quickly that Lonnie flips the script.
Yeah. Knowing what we know about Lonnie and where a lot of his motivation is coming from, it's so ridiculously manipulative. How he's like laying this groundwork and he's doing this performance. And I want to put a pin in that because that's going to come up later with something that I really wondered about in a whole new way that I have never thought before. With Hopper, though, I remember thinking like a horror movie, don't go in there because he gets right up to the gate.
I swear, and he's, like, coughing and hacking and everything else, and I'm like, "Oh my god."
Yeah. I think what they're trying to get you to do is be afraid that the Demogorgon's in there
Right.
because there's that quick shot of like something in the background and you're not sure what it is, but of course it's not. He gets drugged and boom, we're into the title sequence.
Which is funny because I didn't think that was gonna happen, but I'm like, "Hopper's not gonna get eaten by the Demogorgon at this point in time, like,
Yeah.
you can't fool me." But what I was genuinely very concerned about was having consumed a lot of, like, folklore, fairy tales, science fiction, fantasy, whatnot, whatnot, I kind of have the instinct that, like, the closer you get to the supernatural thing, the more the supernatural thing can affect you. So I was like, "You're breathing in this air, you're going into this space, you don't know how it's gonna affect you." Kind of like, if you eat Fae food,
Mhm.
then you can't eat anything else ever again.
Well, I mean, Hades and Persephone, the pomegranate seeds. Yeah,
Right, yeah.
absolutely. But Hopper, thankfully, that doesn't happen to him. The way that Hop is sort of drawn to the gate, it's probably not intentional, but it made me wonder if there's, I don't know, some bit of fate tied up with this that Hopper is destined to go through that gate and find Will. Like he doesn't know that Will is in there, but he does have this like mad drive to find him. I mean, and for perfectly like in universe legit reasons. So it's not surprising that he would be compelled towards it, but it's just considering that he's seeing the thing that in which where he will return.
Right. I mean, I kind of see it a little bit as I know we talked about while we were watching the episode. There's a question of whether the upside down is itself a character. And like I would argue, like from a viewer standpoint, the upside down functions as a character separate from the Demogorgon, separate from the Mind Flayer, separate from everything. The upside down is not just a place, it's also a character. That's one question. But the question that I don't have a concrete answer for, and that I think is very much up to interpretation in a fun way, is the upside down sentient in some way? And if it is, if it's kind of like a Fangorn kind of deal,
Mm.
we know that Fangorn as a force is very angry, but it's not evil. The upside down is unquestionably evil.
Mhm.
There could be a sort of like siren song aspect to it, like,
Oh,
"Come and see, step into my parlor, little fly," kind of thing.
that's fascinating. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how much textual evidence there is for that, but like, it's possible.
Even in the background, like when Hop first steps into that space, every time you see any trace of the upside down, like even I mean the floating particles is one thing, but I mean like anytime you see like the tendrils of it, it's moving,
Mhm.
which makes me think it's alive. I think my like current opinion is probably that it is of some, like I love the Fangorn comparison. That's really interesting. I'm fascinated by that concept. That's a really cool parallel. I mean, actually, a curious additional parallel would probably be Mirkwood because Mirkwood used to be Greenwood
Mhm.
and it's been touched, by evil. I almost wonder if there's a sense of a direction they could go. They probably won't, but a direction they could go is that the upside down can be quote healed, but I don't think
I mean,
they'll.
that would be beautiful, but I don't see them doing it.
Yeah. There's always some other external monster that they have to deal with. It's been the Demogorgon, the Mind Flayer, or the Demodogs. There's never been like any just addressing of the Upside Down as an entity. It's just a place. They always refer to it as a place, which I mean, fair, because those are the things that are actively threatening their world, right? But there's still a sense of like, but they all come from the Upside Down,
Mhm.
but we'll just have to see. After the series intro, we return to the buyer's house, and Jonathan comes home to find both his parents on the couch. And I'm always fascinated, probably as you can tell at this point. I find really interesting the idea of when you see two characters interact after they haven't in a while, when they left things really uncomfortably between them. So, this is the first time I believe we've seen Joyce and Jonathan interact since their fight in the street, which that was bad. That was a doozy. So, it may not be, like we just
Mhm.
may not be privy to times that they've interacted since then, but it's the first time that we see them together as the audience.
She seems very aware of the awkwardness between them. She also seems very self-conscious about the fact that she's been drinking.
Mhm. The sad thing though is that any possibility of like addressing of it is cut off completely because
And Lonnie.
yeah, I am always frustrated that the "can we talk alone" is to Lonnie.
Yeah.
That he pulls Lonnie aside and not Joyce. I'm like, why? I always forget that he's not talking to Joyce. It's always a surprise. Like, part of it too, I noticed his eye line doesn't shift. So it doesn't look like he shifts his gaze from Joyce to Lonnie because he asks her the question, then he says, "Can we talk alone?" to him and not to his mom. But I don't understand. I'm like, that's not what you do. You don't need to tell him to leave. You say, "Mom, I need to talk to you alone." And then you tell her what you and Nancy were
Yeah.
talking about. Like, I
Yeah.
don't, oh, it drives me crazy. I don't
Yeah,
understand.
I feel that on a deep spiritual level. But, like, also at the same time, I feel like Lonnie is, and this is not a criticism of Jonathan, Lonnie is a very convenient target for Jonathan to take out all of his frustrations that he's feeling at the moment.
Sure.
And Jonathan has some thoughts and some feelings, and they need to go somewhere, and he cannot
Mhm.
stand his dad, and he wants his dad gone. So he's just going to direct all that energy towards his dad. And that conversation, as interesting as it is, and again, that's not saying that like it shouldn't be in the episode or anything like that, but that is a prime example of a pissing contest. And what's sad about it is that Jonathan should come out on the winning side of that argument.
Yeah.
He's the one who's been there the entire time. He knows his mother a lot better than Lonnie does. He knows Will a lot better than Lonnie does. I would make a strong argument he's a better person than Lonnie, blah, blah, blah. But just because Lonnie's an adult and an authority figure, he's the one who comes out on top.
Yeah. I mean, and please do not get me wrong. I support everything that Jonathan says to this man. It's just a question of like, but you need to talk to Joyce first.
Yeah, yeah. And like Lonnie coming in and kind of exercising this power is a real threat to Jonathan and Joyce being able to talk to one another, like
Mhm.
just because Lonnie is not going to believe anything that either Joyce or Jonathan has to say, and so on and so forth. Like, I feel the threat of that very keenly. And maybe that's what they were going for. But I agree with you that, had I been in Jonathan's shoes, which what it just occurs to me right now, even though, yeah, Lonnie is Jonathan's biological father, it almost feels like he's a step parent in that moment.
Yeah, yeah, you're right.
He's coming into this like very established set of relationships as an outsider and then and trying to like exercise influence and control where he really doesn't have any business doing that. And I've kind of been just, as a child of two single parents, because my parents got divorced when I was quite young, I've kind of been a child in that situation where, a new adult figure was in the picture and was trying to be like, no, like, maybe listen to your mom or anything, I've certainly never had to worry about demogorgons, but you know,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
and me trying to figure out like, okay, I need to talk to my parent, but how do I do so without disrespecting this other person?
I mean, yeah, and potentially like his thought process at that point is, all right, first order of business is I need to get rid of you.
Mhm.
And then that sends him into a whole different tailspin of like what Lonnie being there means. And then also potentially it could be that because Nancy even brings up like we should probably tell someone and Jonathan says like who? Like no one's gonna believe you, you know. And we'll talk more about that scene when we get there, but Nancy says, "Your mom would." And his response to that is, "Yeah, but she's been through enough." And so maybe, I don't know, maybe that's part of where his mind is at. But you know beyond a shadow of a doubt that she's been right.
I think we have some good analysis here, but I think we also have to remember that they wanted Hopper to be the one who revealed it to her, and they wanted it to be at the end of the episode, so he can't tell her yet.
Mhm. And maybe to some degree, Jonathan also takes some of what Lonnie says, like he takes it for what it is, in that she is going through a rough time, and yeah, you know it's true. That's enough. And actually, maybe it is pretty in character that then Jonathan is like, all right, I'll just take care of this. I'll deal with it, so that she doesn't have to, considering how much she's dealing with. So, all right, fair enough. So from there, we move into the montage of everyone getting ready for Will's funeral, except the dog, who goes to Castle Byers, where I thought was interesting too, we later see that that's, at least in some capacity, that's where Will has been hiding out in the Upside Down, so I thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
We go to Will's funeral. No one seems to be talking, though, to Joyce or Jonathan, just Lonnie. And that reminded me of earlier in the season when Hopper is talking to the guy from Benny's diner, and when he described Will as Lonnie's kid. Like, as much as I hate it, like, on a personal level, I actually really kinda like that we see that people are interacting with him, because that felt very consistent and cohesive in that it's like, yeah, Lonnie has this presence in the community even after he's been gone all this time.
Thing that I thought was interesting in the choice for costume design was that Lonnie looks expensive
Mm.
compared to Joyce. Like, he's got a button-down shirt, he's got a suit, and then he's got, like, a wool coat. It looks very classy, whereas Joyce, we just see that sort of, like, leather raincoat that she's wearing.
Mhm.
It just doesn't look as put together. It looks cheaper than what Lonnie is wearing.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
I think that's a visual way to portray Lonnie having more of an authoritative presence than Joyce. Joyce has a very fractured presence. She has, she seems neurotic a lot, and that's how people see her. That's how people think of her. Whereas they think of Lonnie as being a more steadying, reliable presence.
And I'm guessing too that Elle is just hanging out at the Wheelers while the funeral and the wake go on.
I guess.
It's just like there's just a long section where Elle is we don't see where she is. I just thought that was kind of interesting. I mean, she's probably been doing that for days at a time, but we leap into a flashback between Joyce and Will and haven't had one in a while, so it was kind of cool to see them together. They're so sweet together.
I know. I love them. And I absolutely love the line, "Well, I don't know who's been raising you." I don't know why, I just find that so charming. It's just really sweet.
Yeah, it is. Over in Hopper's trailer, he wakes up and proceeds to tear his place apart looking for the bug and finds it in his light. Then we have this transition to and it's a nice transition to Brenner listening to a tap of the interaction at the Heathkit, and he just simply says, "She was there."
I enjoyed that sequence visually a lot because it reminded me, now granted, this is set, like, very much in the Cold War because it's the '80s, but it actually reminded me of a lot of, like, spy movies that are set a little bit earlier in the Cold War, like '50s, '60s, of that, like, panel of people and everybody smoking cigarettes and, listening to, like, recorded tapes or, like, spy media of some description. So it was very visually evocative.
Definitely. Back in the cemetery, we find Jonathan and Nancy putting a plan together after determining where the thing is attacking. Nancy points out, "So, what are we going to do if we run into this thing again?" Because they're pretty sure that that's an inevitability. And Jonathan busts open the glove box and takes the gun. This is where we have that interaction about, you can tell someone, but they're not going to believe you. And I agree with Nancy. Joyce deserves to know. I mean, we've obviously now talked about Jonathan's decision and why he makes the choice that he does not to tell Joyce, but I agree with Nancy in that moment. At Will's wake, Joyce isolates herself while the kids approach Mr. Clark, and he proceeds to explain the multiverse and demonstrates the theory of the Flea and the Acrobat. This is the explanation. This is what's going on. And I just like it because it's very compelling to watch. Like, this is not a scene that ever gets old. I always enjoy watching this sequence. It always feels compelling and interesting. And I think probably it's the setup of the fact that Mr. Clark doesn't know what he's doing. He doesn't know that he's expositing the solution, the information, the answer to our heroes. And I think that probably plays a part, but the kids are like, we're getting all this information, like, oh no, and I think it's probably a scene that may have looked kind of daunting on paper to film because it's just them sitting around talking about stuff. I think the performances do a lot of heavy lifting in this scene, as well as the musical score and the sound design do a lot of work here. But in general, just it works. It really works.
I love Mr. Clark, and I love the relationship that he has with the boys, and I love that he just goes with it. He doesn't say, "This is not the time for us to be talking about this. We're at Will's wake." He is coming at it very much from an angle of, these kids are grieving, they need a distraction, this is a thing that fascinates them. Let me go ahead and honor that. And I think that's really cool. Like, that's not actually what's happening, but the fact that he thinks that's what's happening makes me respect him as a character a lot. part two of what makes the scene compelling. He is getting this moment to like talk about something that he finds fascinating. And I love like it's a very blink and you'll miss it reference for someone like me who isn't very familiar with Dungeons and Dragons. But when they start talking about like the different dimensions in D&D, he's like, "Oh yeah, like the Shadow Realm."
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. Oh, like the Veil of Well, yeah, I forget exactly how that goes down, but yeah. I love the little moment where Dustin's like, yeah, man.
yeah. Yeah, it's very heartwarming. And I think too, like, while we were watching the episode, I said when Lucas was like, "Yeah, that's not what we're talking about," when, Mr. Clark was very sweetly trying to be like, there is somewhere in the multiverse where none of this happened. And Lucas is just like, "Oh my God, shut up."
Yeah, yeah. I also like too that when Mr. Clark like gives the definition of what the Veil of Shadows is, and while Dustin's like, yeah, I like the way again, I like the way they portray Dungeons and Dragons and the people that play it, because I kind of like that he's just kind of like, yeah, right, and then he turns back to Mike and then goes back to talking about science. Like I like that it's this very much like they didn't turn him into a joke. They're not laughing at him.
Yeah.
He's very comfortable with who he is, and he's not trying to prove something to the kids either. He's just being himself. And it's a good metaphor though. I mean, it feels very strange though. Like it's an odd, why a flea? I don't know. It's like, but it works, man. It works.
Yeah. My question that I probably should have Googled before we recorded is I know that there are like tons and tons and tons of scientific work out there about quantum theory and alternate dimensions and so on and so forth. Like, is this a real metaphor that scientists use, or did they just make it up?
I don't know. It's a good question. I think, and again, it comes back to the same thing that we've said already about the references to other 80s culture and other film references, that whether it is or not, it works.
Right.
We don't have to know science theory to be able to follow the metaphor, and it also doesn't feel like we're being talked down to.
Yeah.
Just really well crafted scene, hats off to Allison to Allison Tetlock and Jesse Nixon Lopez on the way that scene is written, for sure. Back over at Hopper's, Powell and Callahan show up to deliver news of more disappearances, and we can piece together that the Demogorgon is on the move, which aligns nicely with Jonathan and Nancy's discussion from the scene earlier, talking about where it's moving and where, but we find out that this isn't just Will and Barb. This thing is up to no good. They also report to Hopper that the Stadies have located Barb's car. They keep doing their jobs for us, which, yeah.
Oh, what do you know? I never absorbed the news about the other disappearances. This was like, I think this is probably like the third time I've watched the episode, but I never made the connection that like, oh, more people have disappeared. The Demogorgon has killed these people. I don't know why. Like it was very obvious to me this time, but who can say? But yeah, I think I was just so focused on the news about quote unquote Barbara's car that everything else just went over my head.
Yeah. I know I certainly missed it the first time. I think I picked it up on a relatively more recent rewatch. I was aware of it this time, and I think it might also be that I was preoccupied with what Hopper's state is, because he's still kind of looking around wildly, looks pretty disheveled, and just like I think I might have been just a little worried about Hopper.
Yeah.
But yeah, it totally went over my head too. And it's surprising though, because it's not a blink and you'll miss it exchange. They go back and forth a couple times about it, and then Hopper even says, "Mirkwood," which places it for us. And I think that's cute too, because it also says that he's starting to like be on the same page as the kids as well.
Yeah.
That's something I'd be interested to know, if like how many people when they watched it the first time missed that. So another piece gets clicked into place, or thereabouts. We don't really know at this point, like in that moment, Hopper doesn't necessarily know what this means, but it's another step closer. At Joyce's, Lonnie boards up the hole in the wall after having taken down the lights, which Joyce starts to put back up.
For someone who is so charming and has so much charisma, his attempt to like sneak in the idea that maybe they should sue the Sattler company is like so ham-fisted. Like, damn.
I think when I watched it the first time, I think my reaction was, what what? What are you talking about? You did what? Like, because I was still not totally sure what his deal was.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think I had the same look on my face that Joyce did. Like, okay. Back with our group of kids, Mike explains the metaphor to Elle.
The look on her face when he, like, punches the plate with the pencil.
Yeah. Mike and Lucas try to puzzle out, answers with Elle about the gate, and she seems a little nervous. Meanwhile, Dustin is pacing back and forth, distracted about the compasses. He's putting together that they have a way to track the gate. And I love this moment of smarts from Dustin, because Dustin's kind of been a little bit of a like, I don't know, I'm not sure. So this was kind of a nice moment for that character to kind of be a little bit more of the one kind of calling the shots. At least up to now, we've seen him kind of be kind of in between Mike and Lucas about like what they should do and what to believe. And we even see a little bit of that later on in the episode, but I like that he kind of gets to go, okay, are you guys really not putting this together? Rises in the east and sets in the west.
It reminded me of my Pappy Paul when I was a kid. Gave me this like camping kit and there was a compass in it, and he was like, "Oh, let me say this." And he like got it out and was like literally doing like, the Dustin shuffle of like taking it around, and he was like, "Well, it's mostly accurate."
Nice.
I was like, "Oh, okay, thanks. Thanks, Pappy Paul."
Yeah. The other thing too about this sort of science-y smart dialogue that's been scripted, these kids, they rattle it off like they actually understand it.
Mhm.
Like it came from their heads. That's not easy necessarily for adults to do, let alone children.
Yeah, and that's something that I wonder about, whether that comes from direction or whether that is because I was sitting here thinking, like teacher Heidi jumped out, as in, how would I help my actors, if I had young actors who needed to rattle off scientific information, how would I help them absorb what those things mean? Would I print off like Wikipedia pages for them? Would I like what would you do in order to help them? Because like for an adult, you would expect an actor to like do their own independent research, come to you if they have any questions, so on and so forth. But you really can't expect that of children and teenagers because they don't know how to do that yet. Yeah, I'd be curious, like, what the approach to prepping them for that would be.
Yeah. They piece it together though. Justin kind of gets them to this realization that if we follow the compasses, it'll lead us to the gate.
And Elle's like, "Oh shit."
While Lonnie takes a shower, Joyce discovers a flyer in his bag for the lawyers and realizes that that's why he's here. She puts it together. He's only here for the money. Of course, we see the fallout of that in a little bit. I want to come back to that thing that I put a pin in the beginning, which is over the course of the next several scenes, we get this back and forth between Joyce and Lonnie and Nancy and Steve. And based on the stuff that we saw with Jonathan and Lonnie at the top, and then also the scenes between Jonathan and Nancy that come later, I wonder if Jonathan is projecting some of Lonnie onto Steve. That might not be a hot take, but it was the first time that thought occurred to me. But also that the episode is initially may have been trying to make that parallel also. Because this was mostly written before they made the change with Steve, he actually was supposed to be a parallel to Lonnie. That's why we see these two pairs side by side. I mean, even a lot of the stuff that we've said about Lonnie already in terms of how he presents himself, he's very manipulative, he's very good at saying the right thing and knowing how to work his crowd generally. A lot of that can be said of Steve also. So it just made me wonder, was that what they were trying to do? Because again, Steve was supposed to ultimately be a bad dude. He was supposed to turn out to do some pretty nasty shit. And he still does later. So otherwise, you could have just had this scene where Joyce discovers the flyer, followed up immediately by her going, "You were here for the money!" But that because they eventually changed their minds about where they wanted Steve to go, it just made me wonder, was that what they were trying to do? Or was it just coincidence? And I don't know. I don't know how I really feel about that because that's such a new idea to me. I don't even know that it's fully percolated. It might sound ridiculous in like a week's time. I don't know.
That is not a connection that I made. I kind of felt like Steve is trying to ingratiate himself back into Nancy's good graces, as we see. I do think he's sincere. I think this is him very much like figuring out how to be a good person as he goes along, which like he's gonna fall off the wagon pretty spectacularly here pretty quick. But I think this is another example of him genuinely liking Nancy and making an effort to treat her better than he might have otherwise. And with Lonnie, it's just same shit, different day.
Yeah.
This is his MO. This is what he does. This is what he's always done. Maybe there's an inverse to be seen there, because we wanted to think that Lonnie was going to do the right thing, but it turns out he's doing what he's always done. And we're ready to think that Steve was doing what he's always done, but it turns out he actually wants to do the right thing. But I will admit that the juxtaposition did not strike me.
And this could still be like, my old first impression of like, no, Steve was awful the whole time. He never meant any of this sincerely, because, that was a question I had, was because he comes in, he sneaks up on her. Dare I say kind of like a ninja? Considering that normally he's not very stealthy, it was just kind of like we don't hear, like, the sound design deliberately doesn't play fair. We don't hear his footsteps, we don't hear him at all. He's just suddenly right there. And he apologizes, which I forgot he did, if I'm being honest, referring to his dismissal and insensitivity to Nancy's concerns, and also just for Barb as a person. And she holds him to it. She doesn't let him off easy. He also seems to kind of sit there with it. He doesn't try to like make an excuse. He just kind of like, yeah. And then she asks him about his parents and if he got in trouble, to which he says he did, but screw him, and asks about Barb. He does the whole let's pretend everything is okay thing, which we will see again next season. This is kind of, I think, a thing that he does, and which isn't an uncommon method of, trying to help somebody out. I know I've done that before.
Yeah.
This scene in particular felt to me like it seemed to be building to a really sweet moment, and Steve is actually pretty sweet here, even if it isn't necessarily a good match for Nancy. I feel like if it were earlier in the season and Nancy didn't have more pressing matters to be attending to with monster hunting, it probably would have ended differently. I think she might have gone along with it. I don't know for sure, but I think it's a much stronger possibility. He does decide to trust her, and his yeah, sure seems to be in earnest when she, says like, is that okay? And because I think that's set up for what happens later. But he does leave, and Nancy goes back to swinging the bat around. And then we cut back to Joyce and Lonnie. She confronts him, and I love it. I mean, the situation is terrible, but I do like the way she just absolutely lets him have it.
Yeah, same.
The NYU fact reminds all of us how close Joyce and Jonathan really are.
Mm-hmm.
And it was especially nice to hear after their fight, last episode.
Yeah.
And just how angry she is.
Yeah. The fact that his dad doesn't know that he wants to go to NYU and has since he was 6 years old, that's not a detail. That's something that if he had any relationship with Jonathan whatsoever, he would know that. So I think it's a very good example of Joyce calling out the fact that he has been completely absent from their lives.
Absolutely. It harkens back to when Jonathan even said to Will in the flashback a couple episodes ago, does he ever do anything with you that you want to do?
Mm-hmm.
It's always about him. And I love Joyce's line, at least I was here.
Mm-hmm.
And so at that point, she goes, get out of my house.
Which is long overdue.
For sure. And in a great follow-up to that, Jonathan and Nancy meet for their shooting practice, and after demonstrating terrible shooting skills, Jonathan tells Nancy about when he was a kid and Lonnie made him kill a rabbit. I cried for a week, he says.
I mean,
just in case you had any lingering doubts about Lonnie, yeah, he was always awful. And in that scene, Jonathan and Nancy talk about their parents, whether or not they were ever in love, and Nancy turns out to be quite a natural shot.
I love Jonathan's half of the scene. I don't love Nancy's half of the scene. I mean, on the one hand, I think I feel a little bit differently about it every time I watch it, which is legit, but Nancy's half of the scene feels pretty cliched to me. Her saying that she doesn't think her parents ever loved each other. I don't know about that. Like, they certainly don't seem to be like romance novel in love with each other, but I also don't see a lot of evidence that they like hate each other or don't care about each other at all. Like, there's definitely that scene at the dinner table where Ted is just completely checked out, and that's definitely evidence of, like, their relationship not being super close, but, like, they never loved each other at all. I don't know if I see that, and I feel like that scene is really just a lot of setup for Jonathan later on to be like, "You think you're being rebellious, but you're actually doing the same shit your parents did." And he's right, and I don't know that that's fair to characterize her that way, or for her to characterize her parents that way. It just seems discordant to me.
That's fair. I don't necessarily agree, but only because in the sense that, like, we as the audience have seen that scene between the two of them when they're watching the news report, but, like, my takeaway is that the scene at the dinner table, to me, that's the only display of Karen and Ted's relationship that we've seen up to this point that would be seen by the children, like, by Mike and Nancy. Like, there's no, like, outward animosity, it's just they're just kinda stuck with each other. But at the same time, I also do kind of agree with you that it does feel like setup for the following conversation, but I also kind of do buy it a little bit on its own terms, at least better than some of the other setup we've seen before. It's a stepping stone to where this dynamic, this duo is headed, but I like that, like, they can interact, especially, like, kind of coming after the scene with Steve. It doesn't feel super, super like we're trying to set them up as even considering what they're talking about, it doesn't sound a lot like they're into each other yet, but that's just me. But yeah, she says, "Screw that," to the nuclear family idea, and then we swing over to Hopper, who calls his ex-wife, presumably, with what sounds an awful lot like a goodbye.
Yeah, that didn't occur to me. But yeah, I get the impression that this is a periodic occurrence, that he just, like, can't stay away.
Oh.
Like, I don't think he's trying to convince her to get back together or anything like that. I think he respects her, having moved on, but I think he just, like, I don't know, it feels like maybe sometimes he needs to reach out and, like, treat her like a touchstone,
Mm.
which is sad and not healthy and all of that.
I think there's room for both.
Mhm.
It just yeah, it has this, like, note of finality to it. The way that he's speaking to her and the way he's, like, holding the bracelet, and then the fact that he rips the cord out of the wall. And no matter what it is, it's sad.
Yeah.
We catch up with the kids walking along the train tracks, and from that, we jump into the flashback in which we see Elle go into the sensory deprivation tank. This we've seen what she can do, and this ushers us into seeing how she does it. The shot of them opening the tank with the spinning camera, it's disorienting, which preludes what it must be like for Elle.
Terrifying. And every time I watch the episode, I'm struck again by how terrifying that setup is. Like, you can make a sensory deprivation tank that is not that dangerous. Like, I've seen them.
Mhm.
So, like, the fact that they, like, put her in this astronaut suit and in this thing that's, like, completely dark, I'm not saying I don't buy it in universe, because I very much buy it in universe, but it's just another thing of, like, why? Why are you doing this to this child?
In the book, there's a couple quotes about how they shot the scene. So, quote, "The scene required Brown herself to remain underwater, and to underscore her terror in those moments, cinematographer Tim Ives employed theatrical lighting. We used haze and smoke in order to catch light, which is something that was done a lot back in the 80s. I wanted the water tank to pop," he says. "We had underwater lighting in there. That's the main source of light. Sterile environments tend to be something very bright, but I definitely wanted to keep it mysterious and dark in there too." End quote.
Mm.
And then it says too that for Millie Bobby Brown, it was, quote, "particularly challenging for Brown because once submerged, she couldn't fully communicate with her directors." And then this is the executive producer Dan Cohen speaking here. "She had an earpiece on, and the guys, because there's no dialogue in that moment, the guys were talking to her while she was underwater, directing her and saying, 'Give us a sign if you need to come up or anything.' It was a very unique way of capturing that moment, and the set was so cool. That was a moment that I really remember fondly because if you step back and look at it, this is a really wild scene that we're shooting. This kid who was born out of a lab basically is in the water with a helmet on, and yet it was so magical."
Mm.
So, back in the present, Elle tries to get Mike to turn back, but no go, and we see her nose bleeding a little. That's when we arrive at the scene in the woods between Nancy and Jonathan when she asks him again about her picture and what she was saying. He shrugs it off at first and then answers, which leads into their argument. A note that I took was, so we're not done with this, as it turns out, because in our last episode we said how at least now the stuff with the picture is over.
Yeah. I understand what Jonathan was saying, and in a way, I think he's actually right because she had been kind of like trying on the role of popular girl when they were out by the pool, but then once she got into Steve's bedroom, she was a lot more relaxed and a lot more like open and sincere, and we know that because we're the audience. But he doesn't have any business knowing that. Like, just I know I'm flogging a dead horse, but again, he shouldn't have been taking that picture. He shouldn't have been there, or so on and so forth. And I don't, I understand Nancy's being really defensive. I understand that reaction, especially when you're a teenager and someone says something that's unexpectedly true that you don't want to be thinking about. I think the knee-jerk reaction is always to get very defensive.
Oh, yeah.
But her being like, that's bullshit. I'm like, it's not, though.
Well, it's funny though, because something about the way that he phrases it, like, I just saw this girl and you could just be yourself. And like, I don't know, I kind of find that she kind of takes the words right out of my mouth. Like, because this contradicts my theory from earlier, which was he's not necessarily intending to take the photo. It's like, oh no, yes, he was.
Yeah.
And also, there's the sense of like, really? That's what you were thinking when I was taking my shirt off. Really?
Yeah.
So, to some degree, I don't know that anything you can say is going to justify that.
Right.
It's funny. I'm very much of two minds about this because I do actually agree with what you just said, but I also think that she's kind of right. Like, I think they're both kind of right. Where I get uncomfortable is when she starts to defend Steve. It's kind of like, based on what, all of your analysis from that episode. But again, of two minds, I find that I also kind of think she has a point when she's like, you just don't like Steve.
Yes, that is very true.
And that's kind of where, again, like my thought of like, I wonder if Jonathan is projecting Lonnie onto Steve a little bit. Fair or not, I just wonder if that's sort of what's going on in his head, either intentionally or just because Lonnie's on the brain right now, or if he's like, and you are someone that I actually was starting to think was cool. Again, my theory is that they did kind of know each other because their brothers were best friends. But if that's the case, if he is projecting Lonnie onto Steve, and he might not be, but if he is, are we also supposed to be doing the same thing in that Steve could become Lonnie? That we're supposed to take more of that away, then he's going to become Ted. Like, and I wonder if maybe that's also to some degree, that's why Nancy doesn't see it that way, is because it's like, I'm not going to become my parents.
Yeah.
But there's a sense of like, if Steve is more like Lonnie, then yeah, she might not be aware of that possibility because her dad's a doormat as opposed to someone who is sly and manipulative and being a total creep at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And I think something that the series has done relatively well from around this point on is that the scenes between these two are usually really well written. Like their interaction is pretty consistently awesome throughout all 3 seasons.
Yeah.
I mean, the scenes between them in season 3 are some of my favorite things about season 3. I think if anything, I was mostly frustrated that we had to return to this subject. But at the same time, there's part of me that's kind of glad that we did because they do acknowledge it.
And they need to get this shit out of the way before they can move forward in their friendship/relationship.
And I like that they kind of continue to be standoffish with each other afterwards. So moving out of that scene, we go back to Hopper as he arrives at Joyce's house.
He also has a moment as soon as he walks in the door and sees all of those godforsaken Christmas lights. He's like, oh, shit.
Yeah.
Because he knows he's going to have to take apart every single one.
Yeah. Oh, man.
That's got to be, that's daunting.
Yeah. And that brings us to the scene in the junkyard. That establishing shot is so awesome. It starts as this wide, high-angle shot that swoops down slowly, and it circles around the boys, and eventually it settles onto this medium shot of Lucas. And it creates this great visual metaphor for the truth dawning on him before he accuses Elle. The setup, the use of the camera in that moment, I really, really liked that.
Yeah, that's a really great point. So I know that like this scene is kind of controversial. I've heard multiple other people saying that they think this scene and Lucas's reaction is a little disproportionate to what's actually happening. He happens to be correct that Elle is misleading them, but he really goes pretty overboard in his accusations and like saying that like she's the monster and saying that her only goal is food and a bed is it's very cold, it's very cruel, and I have to agree, honestly. Yes, Lucas is very pragmatic. He's the last one to believe anything just because, he's got his feet on the ground. And I respect that and I like Lucas as a character. I have no doubt that like Lucas would be the first one to figure out that she was manipulating the compasses. Don't get me wrong. And I have no doubt that he would be pissed. It just he takes it really, really far. And he has to for the scene to go the way it does, for him and Mike to have the tussle and her to push him off of Mike and for him to get injured, so on and so forth. I don't buy that the scene needed to go that way. And I also don't really buy why Lucas is still so suspicious of Elle because he has seen that every time she made a claim, she was able to back it up. So, like, why is he still acting like she's just this weirdo when he has seen multiple times what she can do?
I struggle with this scene because I do buy his suspicion of her. There's still a lot that's very unclear because this is the same conflict between them from the beginning, and I find that to me it does track. There's still a lot of like uncertainty around her. I buy his suspicion. Do I buy it to this degree? No. They dial it up a little too high. I just think the overall execution, very much like the stuff with Jonathan and the camera, I think this is a case of something where you understand why it's here, and I think this at least tracks a little, better than that, but that it doesn't work in execution.
Yeah, I mean, I remember back when the first season first came out, I watched or heard or read, it's been long enough that I don't actually remember, but there was a critic that I really liked showed some impatience with the fact that, the one in the gang who's always causing, internal conflict and the one who's the quote unquote annoying one is the only black kid.
Mhm.
And I think there is some merit to that criticism. It's just way too intense.
Something that was truly a surprise for me was reading about how they did the stunt of this when Lucas goes flying back. The book says McLaughlin himself was excited to try the stunt, which basically involved his being yanked briskly into foam padding. Caleb's very athletic, Matt Duffer says. That scene was so dope, says McLaughlin. That was amazing because it was like 6 different shots where they dragged me. At one point, I was on a harness flying through the air. It was so much fun. So I thought that was kind of neat.
Yeah. Only a teenager could be like, that was so fun. Oh my God, I was flying through the air.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I just thought it was cute that like he enjoyed doing that. We swing back over to the buyer's house, no bugs. Hoppers tells Joyce that she was right, and the look on her face.
Yeah.
Ugh.
Yeah, that was a beautiful, I mean, both from Harbor and Ryder, just like her whole face journey through realizing A, that someone believes her, B, that she really is right, she's not going crazy, and C, that Will's alive.
Mhm. It made me wonder, in him saying that and her having that response, even outside of this circumstance, all this stuff with Will, when was the last time anyone told her she was right about something?
Yeah.
Especially on the heels of Lonnie going like, "Oh yeah, you're such a screw up and like look what happened with me not being here," and she had to stand up for herself. I was here, she had to fight her own battle, and then to have Hopper come in and say, "No, you were totally right." It's really rewarding.
Yeah.
Technically in the editing we cut back over to the kids again to the end of the fight from that sequence. I really didn't like that Mike throws the phrase "what's wrong with you" back at Elle again. But one thing I thought was cool was that leads into the flashback that's when we see her enter the astral plane. And I noticed this time that the aspect ratio narrows as she makes that transition. This is the first look, I believe, at what she does when she goes into the astral plane. And she finds the man speaking Russian, and then she hears the Demogorgon. We don't see it. I actually thought we saw it right then, but I realized, nope, that comes later. So we've been kind of trying to avoid talking about season 3, but I don't know how we can get around it in this particular instance. So this made me wonder. Elle finds the Demogorgon, albeit accidentally, while looking for this Russian dude, right? So does this perhaps explain one of the biggest question marks of season 3, at least for me? Why and how are the Russians even aware of the upside down, of trying to make the gate, etc., etc.? We don't have compared to the lab where we see so much of what Brenner was up to, and that the gate and the upside down were all an unexpected side effect of the research that they were doing. They weren't trying to find the upside down. So this made me question, is the implication here that the Russians were already looking into these experiments at this point, and Elle seeking it out sort of stumbles onto it because the work is adjacent. And I don't know that that's true. It's just something I wondered, like, oh, does that kind of explain it?
Maybe. I don't know. I don't think that we are meant to worry our pretty little heads about how the Russians know about the upside down.
Yeah. Just something, it's kind of an interesting thing to note. May not go anywhere, but, After dark, Jonathan and Nancy still walk through the woods together, however silently. They come across a wounded deer and decide to put it out of its misery, but before they can do that, the Demogorgon snatches it. I'm pretty sure it was a directorial decision, but like a blocking thing. But I'm actually really impressed that they didn't have Jonathan fire a shot out of surprise.
Yeah.
I feel like that would have been a really classic expectation. Like, I feel like that kind of thing happens a lot. And probably it was just out of necessity, because if he had done that, then it would have alerted the Demogorgon to their presence. So
right.
And they kind of split at that point, and that's when Nancy finds the small little gate into the upside down. When Jonathan seems to have disappeared, she decides to crawl through it,
which is a great choice.
Discarding her supplies beforehand even. It was an interesting moment too, because I'd kind of, just forgotten essentially that Nancy is the first, other than Will and Barb, to enter the upside down. And she spies the Demogorgon eating the deer. When she tries to back away, she snaps a twig, which is a classic moment.
Oh god, yeah.
She screams, the sound seems to reverberate somehow, and it reaches Jonathan. So he comes running, and again, I got this from the book. Apparently, calling her name was really difficult for Mr. Charlie Heaton. The quote from the book says, "This is my first major role with an American accent, and it went pretty smoothly. Funnily enough, there was one word during the first season that I couldn't say in an American accent, which was Nancy. It ended up being a joke with the crew. The forest scene where Jonathan is running around the woods screaming, 'Nancy!' I couldn't say it." The book goes on, "It was a night shoot that ran into the early hours of the morning, and to try and help him, the whole crew was chanting back, 'Nancy!' in an emphatic American accent." I just thought that had to be, like, the worst.
Oh god, yeah.
Poor guy, like, watching it through this time when we watched it together, that I was looking to see, does he say it at any point before that? And he doesn't. I didn't catch it, at least not in this episode. And in the scene, to the audience's dismay, Nancy seems to get trapped inside.
Yes, and I forgot that that's how the episode ends. I was like, "Oh no!"
Yeah.
Mostly because I am 100% sure that every time I've watched this episode, I have just cycled right into the next episode without even thinking about it.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure that when I watched this the first time, I was watching it in bed and I had the lights off. And I remember the episode ended. I reached up and I turned on my light.
That is so fair.
I was like, I've been pretty stalwart for me by my standards with this show. I think I need to turn the light back on. I'm a little bit creeped out. Just a little bit. But I should give you some indication of what my scaredness level is. But this little tiny gate appearing, even in my notes, I said, this left me with so many questions. First of all, what? These little gates, they crop up at random. what's going on here? So, and in our conversation, we kind of collectively deduced that the Demogorgon seems to have control over the way that these little gates crop up because clearly it's hunting and it's not coming through the main gate because there's all this security on it. It's able to slip in and out of the upside down, and that the only reason that this doesn't create conflict in season 2, is because at the end of season 1, the Demogorgon is it's taken care of. It's taken out of the picture at least until the end of season 3. That's as much as we know. And it's certainly not in Hawkins at that point. I think that's the reason that it stops being a thing at the end of season 1, or I guess I should say at the beginning of season 2 because the Demogorgon's gone and that it had control over it, whereas the Mind Flayer does not.
I also just think that they throw it out there for narrative convenience and don't necessarily give an in-universe explanation, and that's okay because, like, in the scenes themselves, it works, and that's what really matters.
Precisely. But yeah, this is a very much a cliffhanger. I mean, this is probably one of the most cliffhangery endings we've gotten yet. That's the end. So, overall thoughts of this episode, it's a very information heavy one, but yeah, this is not an episode that I revisit very often either, but it is a very compelling episode even in the scenes where things are a little uncomfortable. I find that unlike scenes that we've visited already that are also uncomfortable, this one didn't like, I didn't squirm as much through some of these scenes. Like, I feel like it continues to build and have a lot contained in this episode that really feel like we're starting to pick up some speed.
I agree that it's very exposition heavy, but I feel like it's compelling exposition. I think one thing
Yeah.
that the show really excels in doing throughout the season is in spacing out the exposition because, like, this concept is great and it draws on a lot of things that we're already familiar with, and it's not a difficult concept to follow, but it requires a shit ton of exposition. And that's something, in my own writing that I kind of struggle with is balancing exposition. So I admire them for spacing it out like this and keeping it compelling.
If anything, the show doesn't play anything terribly safe in this episode. It takes a lot of big swings, and some of those swings pay off and some of them don't.
Yeah.
Like, I find myself very, very curious to know how they circle back to this and how they resolve these moments. Because like I said, mean, we forgot that they don't leave the stuff with the photography alone. They do come back to it. They do address it. So, I'm just gonna be interested to see, like, how this proceeds. So that's gonna do it. That's gonna conclude our discussion of Chapter 5, The Flea and the Acrobat. As always, thank you for listening.
We'll see you again next time.
And until then, over and out.
I think that was the moment where I was like, "So that's why you're here. Okay. Yep. Fuck you."
Yeah. And I took another look, more detailed, more thorough look through Stranger Things, The World. I keep doing that. Damn it, Hamilton.